We're really pleased to be joined today by our business editor, Will Dunn, who's been digging into the inflation figures to work out exactly why prices are actually so high. He's written the cover story in this week's magazine on the phenomenon of greedflation. So, will you just explain to our listeners who might not have heard the term, what is greedflation?
So the idea is that when we look at inflation, it's not a single thing that has happened. It's waves of inflation. So the first one was caused by everyone staying at home and buying loads of rubbish on Amazon, and that meant that the prices of what economists call durable goods went up because everyone wanted them, and then as economies opened up, there was a second wave of inflation caused primarily by the price of energy. So there was already rising price of energy due to a whole load of factors before Russia invaded Ukraine, and then Russia invaded Ukraine and caused a very, very sharp spike in the price of energy. So you had a demand-led inflation, then you had supply-led inflation. And now you have what a number of people think is profit-led inflation. So, after years of stories about why prices are going up, and indeed very good reasons for prices to go up, companies are adding a bit here and there to, as the Governor of England, the Bank of England has put it, rebuild their margins. It's not necessarily that companies are doing something really evil and just, price gouging us for everything we've got. Although possibly that's the case in the case of some companies. But it is more that across the economy where it is possible to explain to the consumer this is why the price of something has to go up, it may be that they're also making up for some lost profit here and there. And that, that while the prices of, food has been rising at a rate of over 19%. Wages aren't rising anything like that much. And that's why I thought it was very important that we drew attention to it as a cover feature. It is contentious that not all economists think that this is happening. The Bank of England has said that, sort of across the whole economy, profit margins are kind of relatively stable. What that tells me is that across the economy, the cost of the war in Ukraine is being passed on to the consumer, and it's being passed on most steeply to the consumers who can least afford it because, the inflation, again, not just one number, it changes depending on who you are, how much you earn, what shop you're in. If you shop in Waitrose, your personal inflation rate is going to be a lot lower than if you shop in Lidl because their prices have changed by different amounts. That doesn't mean that Lidl is taking a lot more from its shoppers. It means that it probably sells a lot more basic foods which are going up in price more steeply. It is a contentious subject, but when you look through a lot of companies' earnings statements over the last few months, you can see a lot of them, and a lot of them food companies. They are doing very well at a time when the consumer is not doing very well.
Okay, because the rule, I think there's a part in your piece where you say, actually, if costs are going up, profit margins should really come down. That's what the graph should look like. They shouldn't be staying steady or going up.
That's right. Yeah. That is what one of the economists that I interviewed, and I should say, like I said, it is a bit of a contentious subject, but that's why I chose to interview economists who are, these aren't lefty academics.
Yeah, I think one of them is the chief economist at UBS Global Wealth Management.
Yeah, I deliberately went to people who work for
the New Statesman.
Commercial banks, who are, they're not looking at this phenomenon out of a particular, they're human beings. I'm sure they care if other people can afford food or not, but they also, the aim of their job is to give their investors a good idea of what's happening in the economy. So if they're saying it, then there is very good reason to believe that it is there. And one of them highlighted this particular graph where using US data because it's easier to get better data from US companies throughout the decades. When costs rise, profits fall. Costs cut into profits. But since the last quarter of last year, those two lines moved apart in a way that he said he had never seen before.
And the reason people or companies can do this is because there's sort of a psychological expectation that companies, that inflation exists, and therefore companies can increase their prices. Is that right?
Yeah, they've read all of these stories about, the big boat blocking the Suez Canal, supply chains being jangled, the cost of energy, the cost of fertilizer, basically all the things I've written for the last 2 years. And all of those things have been true, that all of those things have been happening. But when you are a company, quite understandably, you might be running, a small shop. It's not just supermarkets, although supermarkets are the kind of price leaders. So the prices they set will influence what other people can charge for things. But if you're in a shop in a worrying looking economy, you might very well think, I need to add a bit extra to pay for the uncertainty ahead and things like that. So yeah, it's not necessarily an evil phenomenon, but it is one that where prices creep in.
And why is the market not working here? Because you would sort of expect if one company increases its prices, another company will see an opportunity and reduce its prices and therefore go for market share.
Yeah.
Why is that not happening?
Well, there's a phrase that's more often used in sort of commodity markets than supermarkets, but it says, the cure for high prices is high prices. And that will eventually be true in that, the consumer does eventually rebel against high prices and seek lower prices, or just stop buying certain things. But firstly, you've got the fact that, with a lot of this inflation being in food, that's not something people can decide to stop buying, as with energy. Also, you have what was talked about during the pandemic more as the K-shaped recovery, where half of society has done quite well. They saved a lot of money during the pandemic. If they owned assets, the prices of those assets were inflated by all the QE that was done. And then you have a lot of other people who haven't had those benefits, but those more affluent consumers, like they're doing all right. They've still got quite a lot of money left. That might be sort of changing now with the savings rates declining, but that buffer has been part of the opportunity for businesses to put up prices, because there are still lots of people who can pay them.
Okay, and what we keep being told in terms of the strikes and sort of public sector pay is that it could lead to a wage price spiral and make inflation worse if we give out the pay rises that workers are demanding. But it doesn't seem that there's very much there's not an equivalent happening for people's wages as there are for companies' profits, for example, as far as I can tell from reading your piece.
It is quite surprising how reticent politicians and the Bank of England have been to discuss the idea that company profits might be contributing towards the very stubborn inflation that we have now. We had Andrew Bailey talking on the news saying people should show restraint in asking for pay rises. Hugh Pell appeared on a podcast more recently, and the chief economist at the bank saying, we've all got to accept that we're poor. Yeah. And I think, in a way, he nearly got it right in that, had he phrased it as, everybody in the economy needs to accept that the economy is more broadly poorer, because as a country we have a terms of trade shock, and that has to be absorbed by everyone. Then I think that's what he meant to say. Yeah. To be fair to him, but he could have been more specific about talking about companies. Whereas, as it came out, it just sounded like, well, you've all got to accept you've got less money, so just stop buying as much food, which was obviously extremely unpopular, and he had to apologise for that.
The way that the Bank of England is trying to deal with inflation is by putting up interest rates. I think it's done that 12 times in a row now. But this isn't necessarily being reflected in what banks are offering to consumers, is it?
No. After the inflation data came out last week, which was, not a good number, especially in terms of core inflation, which had risen. Interest rate expectations rose, and Nationwide and some other mortgage providers increased the rates they're charging on mortgages. So that even before the Bank of England had put up interest rates, long before they're going to do that, the cost of borrowing to buy a house has risen. But you won't see the same happening. There will not be, I'm confident in saying, a high street bank that will say, do you know what, we're going to add a bit more to your savings account interest because we think interest rates are going to be higher. And in fact, they might wait a few months after the bank raises rates just to be sure. They might never raise them. And it's still possible to get an absolutely terrible savings rate from your bank if you have savings. But yeah, so the what banks charge their borrowers rises very, very quickly, and what they pay their depositors rises very, very slowly, and that turns up in the net interest income that they make, which is the big component in a high street bank's income is how much they make from that difference. And yeah, again, they're rebuilding their margins doing that. So before the financial crisis, they could, they could do that. Then 2008 happened, and interest rates, the bank rate was taken down almost to zero. And high street banks, much as I'm sure they would have loved to, they couldn't pay less than nothing to their depositors for effectively borrowing money from them, which is what your bank does when you put money in your account. So they lost a lot of profit over the course of more than a decade because interest rates were so low. Yeah. So now they're seeking to make that money back, get things back to normal. But yeah, in the process, they're going against what the Bank of England wants people to do, because it wants people with savings to keep them in a savings account now. It doesn't want people to go out and spend all their money, because that's more demand in the economy, that's more inflation.
And what about the politics of this? I mean, there's always been a tussle between the government, between the Bank of England, between also consumers about who's responsible for inflation. Liz Truss basically said, it's not my responsibility, it's the Bank of England's responsibility, and they've not done a good job in managing inflation, whereas Rishi Sunak and Jeremy Hunt have made it central to their pledge and promises to the people, the people's priorities, as they call them. They said they're going to halve inflation. And now we've finally got a realization or a factor of businesses being responsible for managing inflation. I mean, where does responsibility lie now? Does it speak? I think it was interesting what you were saying at the start about there being so many different aspects to inflation, and we can't just simply give responsibility to a single actor in society.
Mm-hmm. It always seemed to me a bit odd that Rishi Sunak said, I'm going to halve inflation. I could understand why he said that politically, because he assumed that inflation was going to halve. And he possibly also thought that people might not understand what that meant. He might have thought that people would understand that to mean that, the price increases that have happened would have halved, which is not true. It's the speed at which further price increases will be halved. It was an odd promise to make, and it's turned out to be quite a gamble, because it wasn't really up to him. It was up to the Bank of England. And as transpired last week, inflation is not coming down. In terms of core inflation, which is the sort of real temperature of the economy once you take away the volatile prices like energy and food, there were only 2 countries that have higher rises in core inflation than us. I think that's Argentina, which has got hyperinflation, and South Sudan. So it's, we're quite a serious outlier in that respect. Yeah, so now he's got himself into a position where there is real political urgency to do something about it, in a situation where he was hoping to get away with doing nothing and take the credit. So, yeah, it's a tricky one for him, and that's why he is talking to supermarkets about a deal to cap prices, a voluntary cap on prices of some basic foods in supermarkets, which has been tried in France. But we've already seen that's quite divisive within the Tory party, who are not keen on the idea of price caps, not keen on the idea of being seen as, Ted Heath government.
You make the point in the piece that John McDonnell told the New Statesman that there should be price controls to control greedflation, and actually, optional price caps aren't price controls, but I suppose the language sounds similar to some in the Conservative Party who would be worried about that kind of intervention.
Yeah, they're scared of a return to the 70s, as you say. They just see it as a red line they don't want to cross.
Yeah. This simplistic intervention that's not necessarily going to work, because, like I said, this is really, really complex, and you need somebody like a like a regulator to step in and look at all of the price increases and say what was justified and what wasn't.
Well, that was Ed Davies' suggestion to you in the piece, wasn't it, to have an investigation by the Competition and Markets Authority into supermarkets. And he said that prices would probably come down the moment that starts happening.
And you spoke about the responsibility of the Bank of England as well, but one of the key things I took from your piece was, and the solutions that you suggested, was that it's not all up to the Bank of England. If it is necessary for a regulator to come in, then it's in many ways out of the Bank of England's hands, especially if the banks, the retail banks, aren't acknowledging or going in the direction that the Bank of England wants them to go in.
The idea that we could just rely on monetary policy to fix things is something that I think has become politically embedded over the last 10, 15 years. But as we saw when inflation started to come in, across the world, it was particularly bad in the UK. And I think that was, possibly as a result of a number of political decisions that don't have much to do with monetary policy. Things like the health of our workforce and things like that, or freedom of movement, that kind of thing, which meant that put more pressure on the labour market. The behaviour of businesses within your economy is obviously going to affect inflation and the way in which you regulate them. Yeah, it's not a good idea to just say, well, there's one lever for that.
No, and obviously the consequences of greedflation, I mean, it sort of puts the cost of inflation on the backs of the people who can least afford it. But also, there's more dramatic consequences that some of your sources talk about in the piece. Albert Edwards, who's the head of global strategy at a French multinational bank, he talks about the French Revolution and Tiananmen Square.
I mean, it's always nice when an interviewee will bring up the idea of...
we'll give you a nice closing paragraph for your piece.
But food prices are, linked in a bunch of academic literature to political upheaval. When Russia invaded Ukraine last year, there were a number of people predicting that there would be, sort of bread riots, as there were, again, also before the Arab Spring. There would be upsets sort of around the world as a result of sharp spike in food prices. There was a good bit of international cooperation that went on that meant that didn't happen as severely as it could have done. But yeah, I think it's exposed sort of weaknesses in our economy that we were, or perhaps our government was a bit complacent about, thinking it wouldn't happen to us.
Thanks so much, Will.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me on.
Thanks so much for watching. We'd love to know what you think. Please make sure you leave your comments below. And if you enjoyed watching this podcast, you can watch more of our videos on our YouTube channel. And don't forget to like and subscribe.